Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Northwood University Freedom Seminar, and my name is Dale Matchek. I'm the chair of our econ program here at Northwood University, and I'd like to welcome you here for the final presentation of what has been a great weekend for talking about ideas and liberty and the challenges facing the next generation. And to wrap things up for us, we have a speaker who is no stranger to Northwood University. In fact, George Leef was a faculty member here at Northwood some time ago, and after leaving us, he became a legislative advisor to the Michigan State Senate. He founded a consulting firm to help people advocate issues related to liberty, the Patrick Henry Foundation. He moved on to the Locke Foundation, and he currently serves as the director of editorial content at the Martin Center for Academic Renewal, where he specializes in issues related to higher education. Mr. Leef was educated at Carroll University and, Carroll College, and got his law degree from Duke University School of Law. He has published numerous articles in the Freeman, Reason Magazine, Cato Journal, and many editorials in the Detroit News, Independent Review, and other publications. And he's also the author of a new book, which I want to make sure to mention. This is The Awakening of Jennifer Van Arsdale, a political fable for our time. I haven't read it myself, but I'm looking forward to it. I understand from other people that have read it that it is both informative and extremely entertaining. So I hope that some of you will consider taking a look at that. And at this point, I would like to welcome to the podium Mr. George Leef.
Well, thank you very much, Dale. I'm delighted to be back here at Northwood. As Dale mentioned, I taught here for almost a decade throughout the 1980s. I remember speaking at some of the early freedom seminars way back in the early 80s. Glad to see that the tradition carries on. And I'm also glad to see that Northwood still exemplifies the same ideals that it did way back in the 80s, which I adhere to and support wholeheartedly. The ideas of individual liberty, free markets, limited government. Glad to see so many young people here spending their time to listen to people who share those ideals, and I hope you'll come away from this weekend with a strengthened sense of purpose in fighting for the preservation of freedom in the United States. Now, the theme for the whole seminar has been the challenges in front of us, and you've heard a lot of good content. I heard just the end of that last discussion about public schools. I think the great overall challenge facing Americans of all ages, all races, is the preservation of freedom, regaining the lost freedom. We have to begin recovering the great amount of liberty that has been lost in this country over the last century, but especially at an accelerating pace in the last couple of years. In fact, that is kind of the backdrop for my novel. Is what would happen if the United States had 8 years of total left-wing dominance in the government? What would the country be like at that point? Would we have any chance of avoiding the cliff, going over the cliff, the point of no return? Well, I'm subtly optimistic that we haven't gone past the point of no return, that we can turn things around, we can regain liberty, but it's going to be a hard, hard battle. But we've lost a great deal of freedom in this country. We've lost a great deal of economic freedom. We've lost educational freedom. We've lost legal freedom, particularly in the realm of freedom of speech. And this is all due to an onslaught by the people I'm going to call the takers. Now, the takers, they like to take things from other people. They take their property, and they take away their liberty. And they do so because they want to use liberty and your liberty and their property for their ends, which are to rebuild the country according to their visions, their utopian visions of a perfectly egalitarian, scientifically managed, controlled society. These visions go way back to more than a century ago, to what they like to call the progressive movement, where people like Herbert Crowley, the founder of the New Republic, said, the problem with America is we have too much freedom. Freedom is messy. Some people get filthy rich and other people are poor. What we need is a controlled society, controlled by visionaries like myself, so that we'll have a good society, a fair society, an egalitarian society. Now, these takers are absolutely certain that their vision is correct. They've been supported in their view throughout their entire educational upbringing. Usually it starts in grade school. They're told that the only good vision is the vision of egalitarians, progressives. And contrariwise, anyone who disagrees must be a bad person, must be driven by evil motives, must be greedy. There must be something wrong. Don't listen to those people. These people are absolutely certain they're right, and it's almost impossible to get through the armor plating that protects them from any mental disturbance in the force of their belief system. These are all progressives who believe that they should be deciding all the important questions in society. The questions about what the economy will be like, what will be allowed in the economy, who will be allowed to do things, and what things we can tolerate, what things we cannot. They want to control the social environment. They want to dominate our culture. They don't really believe in freedom. They believe in their control according to their visions. Now, the opponents, I'm going to call them the makers. The takers versus the makers. Well, the makers, according to the takers, should just work, pay their taxes, obey the dictates of their superiors. Hillary Clinton, bless her heart, actually nailed something when she said, we're the deplorables. And that is precisely what they think of people who disagree with their visions. Well, there must be something wrong with you. You are deplorable if you don't want to live under the control of these progressive politicians and pundits and thinkers. Now, their vision happens to resemble a very old-fashioned system, feudalism, where a few people at the top made all the rules and everyone else simply had to obey. Do your work, pay your taxes, obey. That is the proper system. The mindset of today's takers is indistinguishable from that of the ancient feudal manor, the feudal rulers, the manor house, the lords. Now, this also happens to guarantee for the takers a lot of high-paying jobs, and it guarantees them something they really, really like, which is domineering over other people. You know, there's some Americans who are perfectly content, live and let live, just leave me alone. You live your life, let me live mine. The takers aren't like that. They want control. They love control. They want your money too, but I think many of them, they just love the power to dictate to other people. And it's that war that's the central element in my novel, which I really hope you'll find and read. Now, before I go any further, I want to talk about the abuse of language. It's been corrupted for decades by the takers. They wish to obstruct clear thinking by reshaping the language. Just as Orwell noted in 1984, Big Brother's regime was determined to dictate the way people could think by changing the language. Now, consider the term liberal. What does liberal mean? The true original meaning of the word liberal was someone who favored liberty. The liberals were people who wanted to liberate human beings from the domination, the control by kings and feudal manors and feudal overlords, the church, guilds. Adam Smith, for example, was a true liberal. He wanted to liberate people. But about a century ago, the word liberal was corrupted, was taken over, and now we oftentimes hear people referred to, the takers referred to as they're the liberals. But there's nothing liberal at all about them. In point of fact, these people are the very opposite of liberal. They are authoritarian. Real liberals were people like Adam Smith, Frederick Bastiat, people currently living, Thomas Sowell. Liberal is a good word. I'd like to try to restore it to its original meaning. So you will never find me talking about liberals when we're talking about the people in the current Biden cabal, for instance. Those people are the opposite of liberals. They are statists. They are authoritarians. I'm going to rescue this word. Please help me in that regard. Another term that's been corrupted, equity. Now, what the word really means is fair treatment. We have courts of equity where people could go for fair treatment. If they couldn't get fair treatment in courts of law, they could go to a court of equity and appeal for fair treatment. But to today's takers, today's statists, today's authoritarians, they use equity to mean equal outcomes by groups. The people who use equity today, what they're demanding would be, for example, equal rates of punishment amongst groups of people when they misbehave in school. They say that it's inequitable if more black kids than white kids and Asian kids are punished for doing wrong. But that has nothing to do with equity, its real meaning. It has nothing to do with individual treatment. They are misappropriating a good word, using some mental gymnastics to bend us to think that what they call equity is really a good thing. Well, equity is a good word, but what they want is not. Group equality has nothing to do with true equity. And what about the word progressive? Well, that's been a term that was corrupted. Progressive means people who want progress. But the progressive back more than a century ago, what they wanted was state control, government domination over society. Actually, what they want is regression to earlier, more primitive modes of social organization. They are anti-capitalism. What they think is progress, what they call progress, is actually regress, control by a few, domination over everyone else. That's not at all progressive. It's regressive. And then there's the term social justice. You hear this all the time. Whatever the takers want, they say, well, social justice demands that we do this. If, for example, there are supposedly not enough women on boards of directors in corporations across America, well, that is an argument for, that is a case of social injustice and an argument for what they love to do, assert government control over people, and for them to say, you must put so many women on your board. They did that out in California. Now, a court just struck that down, but it shows what they think is social justice. Well, it has nothing to do with justice. In fact, the term social justice is a completely misleading concept. F.A. Hayek took on the concept of social justice in one of his books, and he pointed out that society is just an abstraction. Now, an individual person can either act justly or unjustly, but society is an abstraction. It doesn't act at all. And so it makes no sense about social justice. So let's stop using the term social justice. Let's stop playing these mind games, these linguistic gymnastics, and say social justice, that's a meaningless term. I'm not going to use that anymore. Now, a key point to keep in mind about the takers, they are never satisfied with their degree of control. As far as they've come in asserting government control over our lives, they can always find many more things that need to be done, need to be done according to their vision anyway. They never have enough control. Biden soon as he took office, all kinds of executive orders to do this and that and the other thing, none of it being within the ambit of the Constitution, but they can always find more things that they think need government control. And of course, every time there's more government control, our freedom shrinks a little bit. Our wallets shrink a little bit. For these people, government control is an addiction. They can't say no to it. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard of any instance where some taker, some statist, some authoritarian put out an idea for more government control, but other takers said, no, that would be wrong. The government shouldn't do that. That seems never to happen. They always go along. That's why the most radical of the takers, people like AOC, tend to get their way. Nobody can say no to the takers. They're addicted to government power. Now, as I said earlier, the United States has been losing liberty for a long time. And I oftentimes think about what America was like for my grandfather. Now, he was the son of Swedish immigrants he was born in 1885. His father was a day laborer. My grandfather went to high school in Minnesota. And at age 22, he came up with the idea for a business. And I'm happy to say that business still flourishes today. But back in those days, it really wasn't hard if you had a good idea and some ambition to make a go of business. There were virtually no government regulations. You had to obey the common law. You had to live up your contracts. You couldn't commit torts. But there were no regulations otherwise. There were no pro-union laws getting in his way. There were no laws telling him who he could and couldn't hire. There was no income tax. It was a pretty easy environment if you had ambition and a good idea. In those days, the government absorbed less than 10% of the GDP of the country, which meant that overwhelmingly the resources, the land, labor, and capital in the United States was left for the private sector, where the profit and loss system guarantees that resources are used in ways that benefit consumers and are not squandered on government follies. Back in those days, when my grandfather was running his business, there was no welfare system, so people had to work if they wanted to eat. There were no government jobs for busybodies who would revel in their chance to interfere, dominate over people like the makers, like my grandfather was. And there were no government deals, crony-ish deals for business. Businesses had to succeed on their own merits or fail on their own merits. And because of all these factors, the stuff that made America work, people put their energy into production, into innovation. And for those who really couldn't make it on their own, there was plenty of voluntary help. The prevailing philosophy in those days was golden rule philosophy. Most people believed I should be free to live my own life as long as I don't impede other people in their freedom to live their lives. People didn't look to the government to solve their problems. People looked to their own resources, to voluntarily pooled resources. Almost nobody thought to say, well, we ought to pass a law, we ought to have a government program, when they saw something that wasn't quite right. Now, there were takers in those days, mind you, plenty of them. But they were frustrated takers. What frustrated them was the law gave them no leverage. The law, in fact, protected life, liberty, and property of everyone. That gave them no leverage to demand that people give them resources, that people do what they were told. The takers could ask. They could ask, for instance, would you like to join a union? But they had to take no for an answer. They couldn't. No one could be forced. Or if the takers wanted money for some cause of theirs, they could ask, but people were free to say no. You haven't made a good case, not going to give you that money. And that frustrated the takers. And so what did they do? Well, they put their efforts into changing our system. They began lobbying for new laws, which would in fact give them the power that they did not have. And I think we could put it this way. What they wanted to do was change the law, which had always been a shield for the rights of individuals, and turn it into a sword that they could use against individuals so that they would have the power to take from them, to domineer over them. And in this, they have been extraordinarily successful. A main reason why they've been so successful is because they got commanding heights in a few key respects. One of the most important being, the most important being, the Supreme Court. In the 1930s, the Supreme Court was turned from what they denigrated as the old court, the 9 old men in black robes who kept saying no to FDR's welfare state, replaced the court with a progressive New Deal court. They began to rubber stamp all kinds of new government powers that it was never intended to have under the Constitution. And this is the chief reason why liberty has been shrinking and government power has been growing. The Supreme Court unlocked the gates, and ever since, the takers have been having their way. Government has been expanding in all kinds of realms. Consider, for example, the Heritage Foundation's economic rankings of freedom in the world. Back in the 1980s when it began, the United States was about 5th in freedom in the world. In the latest rankings, the United States has fallen to 25th. And in fact, just the last year, it went from 20th to 25th. The lowest ranking ever for the United States. And I'm sure it's going to continue to plunge as long as the Biden regime is in place. The government now spends something like 50% of GDP, absorbing enormous resources, spending it in the ways that politicians love, usually ways that they think will get them reelected, paying for armies of bureaucrats who produce no wealth themselves but meddle in the lives of other people. And of course, this has given us a vast national debt. The national debt was bad back in 2000, and it's been getting much worse and at an accelerating pace in the last few years. Up in New York, and I think 49th and 6th Avenue approximately, there's a national debt clock. And every second, it's ramping up by millions of dollars. The average American now owes over $90,000 per person, and it just keeps going up, up, up. We have laws and regulations so voluminous that no one could possibly know everything that's legal or illegal these days. But we have legions and legions of bureaucrats ready to pounce on you for any slight violation of these rules and regulations. Now, the takers used to be pretty much content just with going after economic liberty. I think of some of the older takers like JFK and Lyndon Johnson, that they were content to skim off some, and increasingly more, of the production of the American economy for their own good, for their own supporters, so they could enjoy power. That was bad enough. But today's takers are now going after some of the most fundamental aspects of liberty. Consider freedom of speech. The new takers are hostile to freedom of speech. They make no bones about that. They want to silence and punish anyone who disagrees with their agenda. They say that speech they don't like is hate speech. And that's, they claim, is unprotected by any element of the Constitution. If it's hate speech, the Constitution doesn't protect it, and we should regulate it. We should control it. What they want is government power to control speech, control thought. As long as there's freedom of speech, people can disagree and challenge their agenda. They don't want that. any more than Big Brother wanted people thinking and speaking freely in 1984. For example, we now have the Department of Justice threatening parents who criticize the agendas in public schools, calling them domestic terrorists just for exercising freedom of speech. We have tech companies who are eager to deplatform anybody who says things that the progressives don't like. You think maybe the COVID vaccines are counterproductive and do a lot of damage? You can't say that. We won't let you say that. You think there were shenanigans in the 2020? Oh, no, can't talk about election fraud. No, that's disinformation. We won't allow that. A very good example recently. I used to write for Forbes for a number of years. And I heard recently, I was, for reasons I never found out why, I was kicked off Forbes back in 2017. Steve Forbes is a good guy. He sold out. It's now run by a media conglomerate that doesn't really have his values at all. Anyway, a Forbes columnist, Adam Andrzejewski, writes a piece called Open the Books. Well, he runs an organization called Open the Books, and he wrote for Forbes on government misuse of money. Well, when he wrote a piece criticizing Dr. Fauci, the Center for Disease Control got in touch with the people who run Forbes and said, we don't like this. And Forbes, with all the spine of a jellyfish, said, okay, we'll kick him off. This is bad, folks. An alliance between government and big business that is always worrisome, but when it threatens the flow of information, much more so. Freedom of speech is also under attack on college campuses. I'll give you a few examples. I follow this all the time in my work at the Martin Center. Several years ago, many of you probably know this story. The well-known social scientist Charles Murray was invited to talk at Middlebury College up in Vermont. Now, Charles Murray is a very libertarian guy, and he's written about a bunch of very controversial books. And a student group up at Middlebury decided they didn't like Charles Murray. They didn't want anyone to hear Charles Murray. So when he tried to speak, they staged a riot, bullhorns, and they made so much noise that the presentation became impossible. But that wasn't enough. When he was trying to leave, along with the Middlebury professor, a leftist herself, by the way, who had organized this and was going to serve as moderator for the discussion, they were physically assaulted. She was injured. They barely escaped, getting into a car which was being pelted. Freedom of speech, the students don't believe in it. And it's easy to understand why. Most of these kids have grown up in schools where freedom of speech is not prized. In fact, where speech that the teacher doesn't like is ridiculed. Oh, any idea, any argument in favor of capitalism, arguments in favor of limited government, those are usually attacked as racist, homophobic, something wrong, greedy, terrible people. Don't listen to their arguments. Well, if you grow up in this kind of environment, get to college, you're apt to say, oh, yes, here comes that terrible person. I've heard that he has bad ideas. Let's not let him talk. Yeah, let's not let him talk. Freedom of speech is withering on the vine in college campuses. Here's another case. At the University of Pittsburgh Medical School, a professor named Norman Wang wrote an article in which he argued that affirmative action in the medical school was a bad idea. It was illegal, but also undermining the standards of the medical school at Pitt. Well, the administration at Pitt didn't like that. So they demoted him and took away his position as the head of a fellowship organization for medical fellowships. Freedom of speech? No, it's not valued by the administration at Pitt. There are so many other cases like this. I come across them almost every week at the Martin Center. It's also infecting the professions. Doctors, for instance, have been threatened with a loss of licensure if they talk about alternatives to vaccination, if they talk up treatments for COVID instead of locking down and vaccinating people. A lawyer in New York, Maud Maron by the name, a woman of perfect left-wing credentials up until now, but she said she was against the use of critical race theory in public schools, that it's just not appropriate. It's a waste of time. It's worse than a waste of time. Well, the legal profession in New York said, well, she's a terrible person. They had her fired from her job in legal aid. She was good at what she did, but that didn't matter. She had the wrong opinions, the wrong values. So no more lawyering for Maud Maron there. Or another case kind of close to my heart. I love classical music. Classical music is woven into my book, as you will find out if you get it. A flutist with the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. In fact, she'd been there 33 years, was the principal flute player. She posted on her Facebook page some criticism of government COVID policies. For that, the orchestra fired her. Now, what do we conclude from all this? What we conclude is that freedom of speech is just not a value in America any longer. Our culture has turned against freedom of speech. We're going to have to fight to get it back, people. Another part of our freedom that's under attack, due process of law. This is a bulwark of liberty, that there are legal rules that must be followed in every instance. At least that used to be the case, but no longer. It's easier and easier for government officials to deprive people of liberty or property without going through the time-honored legal processes that constitutes due process. For instance, there is this nasty thing called civil asset forfeiture, whereby government officials, usually police, can take property away from people. It's oftentimes cash, but it could be a car, it could be real estate, as long as they can accuse the owner of perhaps having acquired the asset, the property, through some illegal means. Here's the way it oftentimes goes. A case I heard of recently, a guy was going to buy a truck, and he had cash with him. He thought he'd be making the deal. He was going through an airport, was stopped. I think it was in the TSA, and they came across the cash when he went through the TSA. Well. Red flags go up. He is detained by local police, and they take his cash, $30,000. His honestly acquired savings in small business. He was going to buy this truck for his business. But, oh no, the police said, we think this might have been the result of illegal activity. We're taking your money from you. Civil asset forfeiture goes on, state and federal, day in and day out. It has one great enemy, the Institute for Justice, which fights it is tooth and nail every time it can. But there's only one Institute for Justice, and they only have so many attorneys, and there are many, many of these cases. Now, what happens after you've had your property confiscated? Well, then you have to go to court and try to convince a judge that you're innocent. The burden of proof now rests on the deprived party to prove innocence to get the property back. And otherwise, the police get to keep the proceeds, and it goes into their budget. How nice. A strong incentive for corruption and vicious behavior on the part of law enforcement. And of course, we've suffered a great loss of liberty in the last 2 years under COVID policies. We now have to live with a wide array of restrictions on our freedom, which were decreed federal and state and local level usually without anything approaching a legal warrant to do so. These were just decrees by officials. Biden, Governor Whitmer, local officials. They just said, well, we are decreeing that you must lock down unless we say you're an essential business. And of course, there was an awful lot of hypocrisy in this. They allowed meetings and gatherings that were sympathetic to their cause, but any gatherings that they didn't like, shut them down. Businesses they didn't like, shut them down. Churches, not essential, shut them down. And unfortunately, we now have a precedent. These lockdowns, these mandates, set a precedent. They'll probably be used again in the future. For instance, there have been talk about lockdowns to save the climate. They're very serious about this. They think that they now have precedent for locking down in order to reduce carbon emissions. Well, they probably would do that. Now, illegal dictates like this are nothing new. In our history, go back to 1942, World War II. FDR, through an executive order, declared that more than 100,000 American citizens who are of Japanese origin would be arrested and put in internment camps. There was no constitutional basis for it. He just put out that order. Now, that was challenged in a 1944 case, Korematsu versus the U.S. And the Supreme Court upheld the power to do that. Precedent's been upheld. But Justice Robert Jackson, a truly great civil libertarian, wrote of this in his dissent. He said that when government can set aside the Constitution because of an emergency, quote, it's like a loaded weapon ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of urgent need. Well, Governor Whitmer can do that, and future politicians, they'll claim some urgent need and say, we have to do this, and you must accede to our power to whatever they want to do. This is a dangerous precedent we've set. So the very concept of freedom, the taproot of this country, is mocked by the takers. As you probably know, President Biden refers with contempt to Americans who argued that they didn't want to be injected with a dubious vaccine. He said, these people talk about their so-called freedom, sneering at people who think they should be at liberty to decide what goes into their body and what doesn't. It's kind of astounding that the President of the United States could speak with such contempt for the very idea of freedom. But that's the taker for you. They don't really care about freedom. What they care about is control. It wouldn't surprise me if today's takers wouldn't like to rewrite the Star-Spangled Banner. You know that line about land of the free and home of the brave? Well, that doesn't really apply anymore, does it? But I think they would like it to say is the land of the obedient and the home of the timid. That's a line I worked into the book, by the way. So, if my grandfather were alive today, he'd hardly recognize America and would be astounded at our loss of freedom. So the question is, can we stop it? Can we have a chance of reversing it, regaining our lost freedom? Well, let's look at the opposing sides in this battle. The takers today control the White House. They control Congress. They control the vast, sprawling federal bureaucracy. Money. Well, they have access to vast sums in the federal budget they can and do use to influence people, get them to buy their support. Huge welfare system. Now we even have the COVID relief system. People being paid not to work if they say they're afraid of getting COVID. We also find that they're very good at using public money to support other statists, other takers. A good example, the speaking engagements that they oftentimes arrange for well-known taker speakers. Hillary Clinton gets vast sums of money for speaking on college campuses. This guy, Ibram Kendi, the big guru of anti-racism, recently got paid $32,000 for a 1-hour Zoom talk by the University of Virginia. You know, they can take vast amounts of taxpayer money and put it in the pockets of their allies and friends. That's a big asset to them. And philanthropy. If you take a look at the philanthropies on the left, those that support the taker agenda, and compare them with philanthropies that uphold traditional American values, free enterprise, the imbalance is about 5 to 1. They have far, far more money. And Soros and Ford Foundation and lots of other foundations that have been overturned from the visions of their founders and now pursue visions that the founders would hate. Howard Pugh, Henry Ford, for instance. Now, they also, of course, have the media on their side. The media almost always sides with the takers. Today's reporters are mostly clueless young zealots who have been conditioned to believe more government is what we need. And they will smear anyone who argues against them. They don't argue back, of course. They resort to smears. Good example, Charles Koch. Recently smeared because he said, you know, we maybe shouldn't get involved in this war in the Ukraine. Well, they smeared him as somehow saying Putin was good. He didn't. But to them, because Charles Koch is in favor of free enterprise and limited government, anything he says must be smeared. The media uses his influence to protect the takers from people realizing all the damage that taking does to their lives. And then there's the education system, maybe the crown jewel in the taker's crown. Long ago, the takers decided this would be the best commanding height for them to seize if they wanted to achieve their vision of America. They knew that Abraham was right when he said this. He said, the philosophy in the classroom in one generation will become the philosophy in the government in the next generation. Well, the takers knew that was true. So they set their sights on gaining control of education from top to bottom. Colleges, high schools, kindergarten, they wanted control everywhere. And of course, we see the results. We see that they've smuggled in CRT ideology, critical race theory, gender ideology, environmental ideology. This is seeping into the classrooms at all levels. Instead of learning the basics, learning the 3 R's, kids are now learning that America is a bad place, that certain races are oppressed. They've learned that we have to be in fear that the environment is going to collapse unless government does something drastic. And any student who dares question this, of course, is going to suffer for it. So they've seized control of the education system. That's especially true in college. Luckily, not so here at Northwood. But at many other colleges, the majority of the faculty, in fact, the overwhelming majority of the faculty, see their roles as change agents. They're not there to pound bodies of knowledge. What they're there to do is to create intellectual clones of themselves. They're there to create senses of grievance and hatred toward the traditional American values. And they're very successful at this. And they become increasingly brazen in their propounding of ideology throughout college and the high schools. If anyone complains, like parents who've said, we don't like what you're doing in our schools, what happens to them? Well, they are demonized as domestic terrorists by the Attorney General of the United States. I'm absolutely convinced that the takers envision, they thought they were very close to this after the 2020 election, something I'll refer to as the final solution. They wanted is an America where they would once and for all lock themselves into control of the government, where they would so beat down opposition through all the means possible, use of the IRS, use of the bureaucracy, limits on freedom of speech. They wanted to so completely stifle opposition, they would have permanent control cemented in place. And I'm afraid they're darn close to it. The question is, can we pull back? The momentum has been in their direction for 100 years. Can we pull back from the edge? Can we turn things around? Well, what do we have going on our side? Well, we still have a few judges who believe in the rule of law, who don't accept the living Constitution idea. The rule of law is threatened, but it's not gone, so that's good. Journalism. Well, they pretty much own journalism, but not completely. There's still some journalists who are doing valiant work. I think in particular Project Veritas, James O'Keefe's operation, where he keeps using videos to show people the truth of what's going on, what these people are really doing, what they're really like. That's having an impact. They really hate him. They want to get him. The New York Times and the Justice Department have cooked up this bizarre and absurd case about Ashley Biden's diary. They're attacking Project Veritas. That proves he's doing something good. And we have a huge reservoir of pro-liberty scholars. Adam Smith, Frederick Bastiat, Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, and many, many others. We have a great reservoir of intelligent, penetrating criticism of the whole taker ideology. We can and do make good use of it. Yet, it still seems an unfair fight to me. Looking at the correlation of forces, as the Soviets used to say, well, what they've got on their side, what we have going on our side, it's an unfair fight. Except, maybe not, when one considers this fact. The taker's agenda creates victims day in and day out. And people are seeing that more and more every day. The promises of the takers, the progressives, they promise prosperity and harmony, but what it delivers is clearly opposite. People are starting to catch on to that, I think. Instead of prosperity and harmony, what we're seeing in the United States, decreasing prosperity, increasing polarization. And statism does create victims. Like the lady who complained in New York City about the mask mandate for young kids. Her kids. Well, she happened to be the employee of New York City, and she was fired for criticizing the mayor's mask mandate. People are finding out that there is a mailed fist, an iron fist, inside the supposedly kindly velvet glove of government. People are realizing this. People are catching on to the fact that government is not your friend, as it's been touted to be. We now see falling standards of living in the United States. You see inflation ramping up. This is going to work to our advantage. People are coming to distrust government. For decades, the takers have tried to get people into this mindset of trust the experts, believe in the government. Luckily, people are now starting to distrust government more. That's a good thing. This is going to work to our advantage. What we have to do now is renew the spirit of liberty, belief in freedom in the United States. And in this regard, it's not going to be enough just to defeat the Democrats this year, maybe throw Biden out in 2024. That's not enough. We've done that before. That's happened before. We've changed parties. And yet, the great overall trajectory of the growth of government power and the decrease of liberty has hardly changed at all. What we need to do is restore the spirit of liberty. Get people once again believing, as people in my grandfather's generation did, in individual rights, in private property, believing that the way to solve problems is not by looking at the government, but through voluntary action. I think we have a very good chance of doing that. The belief system that animates these takers is really an intellectual house of cards when you look at it. Almost any breath of reality is likely to send the whole thing toppling over. That's what happens in my book, by the way. Consider some of the beliefs of the statists that I think are easily knocked over by a whiff of reality. They tell us that government spending stimulates the economy. Don't worry about deficits, it stimulates the economy. Well, we've had unending growing deficits, and what's happened to the economy? We got rising inflation. It's not doing very well. People are catching on to that. We're also told by the takers, well, inflation is caused by business greed. But I think people are becoming skeptical of that excuse. That business hasn't changed. Businesses didn't suddenly get greedier this year. They're not buying those excuses like they used to. They used to also believe, they wanted everyone to believe, that public officials are animated by their concern for the public welfare, the public good. Well, fewer and fewer people believe that than ever, especially after COVID. We've seen that public officials who were supposedly experts really weren't expert at all. We've seen that people who were supposedly following science were really just following their authoritarian instincts. We saw, for example, that a number of true scientists put out a document saying lockdowns are not going to work. We should do something else instead. We should work on protecting the vulnerable. This is something called the Great Barrington Declaration, by the way, put up by three eminent epidemiologists. How did the government react? Well, Fauci immediately said, we have to discredit this. Now, scientists look at data. They look at results. They look at arguments. They consider opposing sides. He didn't do that. He said, we have to discredit this. Lockdowns, vaccines, mandates. Don't allow, humanize anyone who disagrees with us. Well, I think people are catching on. That people like Fauci, they're not experts. They make mistakes. And when they do make mistakes, they don't rectify them. They double down on them. More victims. This is going to make people more skeptical about government. Also, consider the inculcated belief that we must have gun control laws. Gun control laws will reduce crime. Well, Biden's been ramping up the attack on the firearms industry. That's stop violence? Well, no, didn't do that at all. And I think more and more people are realizing that this is just an empty cliche, that gun control solves crime. I saved that one for last, by the way, because that is the incident that really sets things going in my book. So all these elements in the statist mindset are fragile, very weak. And I think they're open to intelligent criticism, and people are going to listen to our criticism more and more. So where is big government vulnerable? It's vulnerable at many, many points. Consider education. Now, they've seized control of the education system top to bottom. But more parents are starting to walk away, starting to criticize. That's a very good thing. The old belief that the public school system was there for the good of all. People are now questioning that more and more. During the COVID crisis, lots of parents, when the schools were closed, they said, well, maybe we can do something on our own. Let's form learning pods, or let's see if we can homeschool. And guess what? Those worked out very well. The belief in government schooling as a necessary thing starting to crumble. That's good. That's on our side. In higher education, well, enrollments are down. People are becoming more and more skeptical of the old idea that any college degree is a great investment and the government should subsidize it to the nth degree. Well, people are starting to distrust that. For many people, it's an investment. But for many others, it's a waste of time and money. And then the more people who walk away, the fewer people who listen to the indoctrination from professors who are there as change agents. This is a good thing. Also, there's now a great deal of data available to show people which programs, which degree programs are actually valuable and which ones are a waste of money. Well, it turns out that if you want to study something like engineering or accounting or economics, you're probably going to turn out rather well. Conversely, if you study gender studies or sociology, you may wind up with a vast amount of debt and little income to pay it. Well, this is good. Colleges are going to have to start closing down those departments because they're not going to be able to pay for themselves as enrollments decline. That's a good thing. And maybe as the federal budget gets worse and worse, which it will, the cost of servicing the national debt is rising geometrically, and as interest rates go up, it's going to rise even faster. This is going to make some future president, maybe the very next president, put him in a position to say, or her in a position to say, people, we can't afford many of the things we used to afford, and so we're just going to have to chop them out. What could go? Oh, how about the Department of Education, which educates nobody, but gets in the way of good education for many. Now, Reagan wanted to abolish the Department of Education, couldn't do it in those days, but maybe it's going to be feasible in the near future. And of course, there are many other federal departments that could and should go. Energy, HUD, labor, all these things. There's no constitutional warrant for them. We can get rid of them. We'd be all lots better off, except for all the takers that used to get lots of government money for making life miserable for the rest of us. But that's going to be a good thing. And then so we start to downsize the government. Here's an analogy for it. I think it's going to be like a person who goes on a fitness regimen. And when that person starts to see good results on the scale, says, wow, this is good. I like what I'm seeing. Let's do more of this. I think that will happen in the United States. When we start downsizing the federal government, we'll see that life doesn't get worse, it gets better. People want more. Maybe we can actually reverse the ratchet. Instead of more and more government, less and less. Maybe we'll actually get competition to see how much we can get rid of. Now, to bring about this transformation, we need opinion leaders. And in this respect, you folks can play a big role. You can argue with all your knowledge, and I think you now have a considerable store of knowledge, and you know where to find more to make your case that we need a free society, not a controlled society. Now, here's one little tactic I'm going to suggest for you. To politicians, candidates for office, ask them this question. What is your plan for downsizing the government? Where will you institute economies? What laws would you repeal? What departments would you axe? They hate that. That strikes fear in their hearts to know that people want a real answer showing that they want less government in their lives. See if you can find a way to ask that question, either in person or through social media, a letter to the editor, whatever. Ask politicians. If lots and lots of Americans start doing that, we start to change the culture. And as Andrew Breitbart correctly observed, politics is downstream from culture. We change the culture so people are thinking we need more freedom in America, less government. We have a fighting chance of pulling back from the cliff. The solution is never more government. The solution is less government. So let's start making that case. And I think if we do so, we have a fighting chance of turning this country around, getting back to the roots, the taproot, freedom. Don't be afraid to fight this fight. We've got to. You'll be demonized. You'll be attacked. So what? Just think about the Canadian truckers. They wanted a little bit of freedom. They suffered cuts and bruises, but they did the right thing. They know it. If you fight the good fight, so what if people call you names? Ignore them. Well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I think we have enough time left for some Q&A. Anybody? Yes, sir.
So, my history is a little fuzzy because I don't know exactly who maybe the administrationists you're referring to back a century ago. Could you kind of enlighten us on maybe what administration it was that kind of started this snowball?
Yeah, I sure could. The progressive movement began in the late 1800s. They backed candidates who favored increased government. They backed socialists. They backed, in those days, you may be surprised to hear this, the Democrats were actually the small government party for the most part. They started backing socialists and other candidates who told people that we're going to have a better society with more government. Then, by the turn of the century, the first real progressive president was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt loved the idea of using government power, whether it was constitutional authority for it or not, to do what he thought should be done. Roosevelt was a progressive. And then, the election of 1912 was the real watershed. Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a deep-dyed progressive who hated the Constitution's limitations on government. As a college professor and college president, Wilson railed against that antiquated Constitution and its limits on government. He believed in scientific management by experts. That was the watershed, Wilson. Then we had a nice interregnum. After Wilson was defeated, well, the Democrats were defeated. Wilson didn't run in 1920. We had 8 pretty good years under Harding, who was lazy and a little bit corrupt, but he downsized the government. Got rid of a lot of Wilson's World War I government restrictions. And then Calvin Coolidge, who was even better. The government actually shrunk in true terms. The dollar budget was lower by the time Calvin Coolidge left office than it had been when he entered office. But then FDR. The Depression was blamed on the free market. People drew the wrong conclusion. The Depression, as I hope you may know, was not caused by the free market. It was caused by bad government policy that upended our monetary system. But the statists, having seized the universities and they were the leading intellectuals, they convinced the people that it was because of capitalism and that more government was the solution. So we got FDR. Well, actually, Herbert Hoover was also pretty progressive, and he started all the government interventions that made things worse. Then FDR came along and made things much, much worse. But people seem to still believe that government was the solution to our economic woes. The Keynesian economists told them in college classrooms that, oh, when things are bad, the solution is government deficit spending. A lot of people believe that. A lot of people still do. So that's in brief the history. We had those regimes, those presidencies, people drew the wrong conclusions. We have terrible policies that are still with us.
To follow up, because I really appreciate that. Did FDR do those policies in order to get reelected, or did he truly think that those were the way our society thought?
I think he really believed in it. His schooling had led him to believe that freedom really didn't work very well. He actually wasn't a very good student. I've read, but what he read was Wilsonian stuff. He heard a lot of Wilsonian stuff when he was a student, and it seeped in his consciousness. He believed in big government. He also knew that he would be more likely to get elected if he promised things through the government. He was one of the worst presidents in American history. The long-lasting damage. FDR is one of them. Wilson's another one. And there's Lyndon Johnson. There's quite a few vying for the lead and most damaging president. And let's yes, sir. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Minimum wage goes back to the 1930s. Part of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1937, which under the old Supreme Court would have been declared unconstitutional. But by 1937, the court was in FDR's pocket. The minimum wage has always been sold as a way of helping the poor. But there were a lot of people who knew that the minimum wage had selective impacts that would benefit their areas politically. For instance, there was manufacturing in the North, states like Massachusetts, where there was a lot of textile manufacturing. And they were suffering from competition from the South, where their labor was cheaper. And so they said, hey, we gain a competitive advantage if we make a uniform national minimum wage that'll make Southern textiles less competitive with us. Same thing with the Davis-Bacon Act, which says that on all federal construction projects, a certain prevailing wage must be paid. Well, what this does is it eliminates competition from lower-priced, non-union labor. And a few of the advocates of that law were actually careless enough to admit that it was done to hurt the chances of black workers competing with white workers. Walter Williams has made this point brilliantly in a number of his writings, that the Davis-Bacon Act and the minimum wage were truly racially motivated to help whites and hurt blacks. Another question. Yes.
We have two sides that are in the mindset that they are 100% correct. There is nothing that's going to change that. That's the same viewpoint for both sides, just with different opposing views. If we were to take your suggestions and implement them as makers to make change against the takers, who is to say those takers are not going to come back at us with stronger power, taking us down? How do we counteract that?
I think we have good arguments based in reality. They don't. Reality works in our favor. There are countless instances of societies that have moved in the direction of takers that have fallen on hard times, where the people are downtrodden, miserable. Venezuela, for example, is the current best example. The takers took over, and the people are now miserable. Those examples are legion throughout history. Show
that the impact of taker policies are harmful in reality. I don't think they can ever show that freedom is actually harmful. We can show that free people are good at solving problems if they are allowed to. Whereas government, put them in charge, they'll usually make bad decisions. After all, government officials aren't in any way punished for making bad decisions. Doesn't hurt Fauci that he's damaged so many kids' education and ruined so many businesses. Government officials pay no cost for being wrong. That's the best lesson ever from Thomas Sowell, by the way. Government officials don't pay the cost of being wrong. So we should have as few decisions made by government as possible. I think that's an argument we can sell to people as they become more and more skeptical of big government. I think we have time for about one more.
We have a couple online questions for you.
Okay, where are they?
Yep, I got them for you. So these come from Hannah. One says, regarding the Students Against Speakers on campus, isn't that just another form of First Amendment rights, the right to protest?
Preventing other people from speaking is not a protest. Now, it has nothing usually to do with the First Amendment, by the way. The First Amendment applies to government restricting people's freedom of speech. But the value of free speech exists irrespective of the First Amendment. And what we need to do is persuade people that nothing is gained by preventing the flow of arguments and ideas. It has nothing to do when we prevent, for example, Ilya Shapiro, who was recently shouted down by law students, of all people, at Hastings College of Law. When you prevent an Ilya Shapiro from presenting his arguments to people, that is not an exercise of freedom of speech. It is a derogation of it. It's an attack upon it. Another question. Yes, sir.
At the moment, the U.S. government has restrictions. If you want to go to America from Europe, for example, you need to be fully vaccinated. But why do they have those restrictions? Because a lot of Europeans are vaccinated but not fully vaccinated, and they are disturbing the economy in tourism.
Yes, you're so right. This is another instance of a government mandate that really has no basis in science. Going back to 2020, government officials propounded the notion that vaccination was the silver bullet that would end COVID. Just get as many people vaccinated as possible, as fast as possible, and we won't get past this. Well, a lot of people got vaccinated, and what we found out subsequently is that vaccination does not prevent you from getting it or spreading it. And nevertheless, despite the evidence of that, they continued with their policies of you must be vaccinated or else. Now, here's a terrible case I heard about just recently. There's a 9-year-old boy who needs a kidney transplant. This is in Ohio. The only match they can find was his father, who was willing to do it. But because his father had not been vaccinated, he'd actually had COVID and recovered from it. But they said, you haven't been vaccinated, so we won't let you donate your kidney. This is incredible tyranny. But I think now we're starting to see these people are petty tyrants. And they don't care what damage they do. They're impervious to evidence. They're impervious to logic. And that's why we need to turn away from letting these people control society and putting it back in the hands of individuals who can act in their own self-interest, use their own knowledge, act as entrepreneurs. That's what this country needs to do.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.